this guide, we will be preparing you for anything you may like to know for your first dungeon experience as a tank. After that, we branch out to other more general tips and hints that can be useful for all sorts of content as a tank, or perhaps even as a damage dealer or healer. After all, knowing how your allies think helps you play better. A highly central mechanic of the tank role we will not be covering sufficiently is the concept of Enmity, which I have a completely separate guide on. If you would like to know more about this concept, I would highly recommend you watch the video in the top right corner. We will be broaching the subject of multiple role actions, and if you want a more in-depth explanation of each individual cooldown, or at least a different take on them, please see the video on that in the top right corner. With all that out of the way, let's start with the tank stance. Regardless of what tank you're playing, from level 10 onward, they all have access to an ability that causes them to do 10 times more enmity. It is crucially important this effect is active when you are tanking, as otherwise, DPS and even healers will be capable of dragging enemies off of you. Warriors use Defiance, Paladins use Iron Will, Dark Knights use Grit, and Gunbreakers use Royal Guard. Always start a dungeon by checking if it is active. It will always toggle off when you enter content that scales you down in some way. Next, let's talk about pulling, which will be the first thing you have to do in a dungeon after activating your tank stance. This is a much broader subject than it initially appears. Let's start with how you actually go about pulling a pack of enemies. There are two common ways that you can definitely mix together in multiple ways. Option 1. The ranged attack with a taunt weave. As soon as you are in range, you use your tank of choice's ranged pulling attack and immediately find another target to use Provoke, the universal taunting action, on. This gives you time to find a third target to use the ranged attack on again, or alternatively, you can use your job's AoE attack once you're in range. Option 2. Run up to the pack. They will typically turn their attention to you and run toward you. Just keep in mind that you don't have long before they start spreading to your group. When you are in range to hit them with an AoE attack, go for it, but wait just a moment longer than what seems reasonable, as due to how the game is designed, your AoE attack's area is placed just slightly behind you, rather than perfectly on top of you. Make sure to hit everyone as quickly as you can. If you just miss one, you can use Provoke to pick it up. Once you have established attention on all the enemies in the pack, what do you do next? A common question is how many packs to pull. In higher level dungeons, you will often be prevented from pulling more than a certain amount due to walls only disappearing after beating the currently available packs. Two common pulling strategies include 1. Pull everything until you're stopped by a wall, and 2. Pull 2 to 3 packs at a time. These two strategies are the common expectation in a dungeon, but if you don't feel confident in your ability or are there for the first time, it is always okay to just pull one pack at a time. Just keep in mind that sometimes patrols or other mechanics may make pulling multiple packs at once the easier way. By extension of that, how does pulling multiple packs work? Circling back to the initial pull, you may realize that the two options presented both make it sound like the act of pulling is a rather stressful act, with very little time. This is for a couple of reasons. The obvious one being that the enemies will go all over the place if you don't act fast. The other reason is related to your party. They can't possibly know if you intend to keep going or if the pull is done without watching you. As such, if you stay at the same pack for too long, you may notice the healer putting down a stationary healing field, the ninja may summon a damaging circle on the ground, and so on. For these reasons, you want to pick up the enemies quickly, decide whether you want to grab more, and immediately go for it, and repeat the same process of pulling on each pack to make it as smooth and quick as you can. Again, it is very important you understand that pulling many packs at once is not a requirement to tanking. You will learn to do this with practice. To make the breezy pull easier to pull off, keep in mind that when you use sprint outside of combat, it lasts 20 seconds, while if you use it while in combat, it only lasts 10 seconds. The trick is to use sprint just before you enter combat, and then make the most of it. Now we get to the standstill at the end of the pull. Tanks take the same damage from all sides, meaning you don't have to worry about enemies attacking your front specifically. What is important, however, is that a large amount of jobs in Final Fantasy XIV do frontal cone attacks, or attacks centered on an enemy, so if the enemy is spread out all around you in a circle, your party may find it difficult to attack all the enemies at once. As such, your first order of business as soon as you finish pulling is to move in such a way that all the enemies bunch up. Sometimes, the enemies will shuffle away from each other as the fight progresses. You can combat this shuffling by lightly moving a bit to the sides and backwards and such, see what works. If there are ranged enemies, you may sometimes be forced to move the melee enemies to it, and with multiple ranged, move far away to make them bunch up and then move the melee enemies to them. You should also make your best attempt at staying within fields your party puts down. We will return to this later. Now, the last thing on pulling bosses. Often, boss enemies will have abilities that swipe in an area in front or behind them. The more common one is in front of them, and for this reason, the common procedure is for the tank to run through the boss so it turns around and faces away from your party. This also makes it safer for melee jobs, as they will not be too far away from the healer. With that huge subject out of the way, let's talk about defensive cooldowns. In Final Fantasy XIV, defensive cooldowns stack multiplicatively. What this means is if you use a 20% damage reduction effect and a 30% damage reduction effect at the same time, they will not result in a 50% damage reduction. Instead, you first take the effect of one and then the effect of the other on the remaining damage. Subtract 20% off 100%, you get 80%. Then you subtract 30% off the 80%. 30% of 80% is 24%. As such, your end result is taking 44% less damage, rather than 50%. Because of this interaction, tanks commonly spread their defensive cooldowns over a large time frame, rather than using them all at once. Another reason for this is that healers have a lot of healing options, and many of them don't really cost them anything to use. As such, if you prevent a huge amount of damage for a little bit and then take the full damage afterwards, then the healers will spend the first amount of time doing very little and then afterwards feel overwhelmed. As such, it is better to think of tanking as smoothing the damage intake rather than preventing damage. Simply taking predictable and reasonable amounts of damage is much more valuable to your healer than you blocking more damage. Outside of special cases where you need multiple cooldowns to survive a massive hit, you should stick to a cooldown order, keeping just one up at a time. A common order of priority is to use your 30% damage reduction cooldown first, followed by the 20% one. All tanks get one of each. After that, reprisal is an option that reduces the damage done by enemies rather than the damage you take, meaning it can help your party take less damage instead of just you. On regular enemies, not bosses, arm's length can also be used to slow their attack speed. Just keep in mind that arm's length is primarily a knockback immunity cooldown. Each tank also has a short cooldown defensive option that you can quite effectively weave between the longer cooldowns to make your cooldowns last longer. To take an example as Gunbreaker, you can use Nebula, followed by Heart of Stone, then Rampart, then back to Heart of Stone, then Camouflage, and again Heart of Stone. For individual targets, you also have access to Low Blow for stunning regular enemies, and some bosses in A Realm Reborn. Make sure to use this, as stopping an enemy entirely for a few seconds can be a lot of damage avoided. If the enemy is using a spell at the time, you can prevent that too. Interject works as an interrupt that can stop any enemy as long as you target a specifically interruptible spell. You can identify interruptible spells by their pulsing and flashing cast bar. Make the most of the ability by interrupting as late in the cast bar as you can. After those major sections, let's dive down into some smaller case-by-case subjects, starting with moving around as a tank. You should know that melee DPS jobs have positional requirements to fulfill to make the most of their attacks. This is the reason why they often run back and forth behind the enemies. To make it as easy for your group to predict your movement as possible, you should only move when necessary. Don't run around or back and forth and such without reason while tanking. It confuses your group and can be dangerous if the enemies use AoE attacks. By extension of this, what kind of actions do your groups use to help you? Here's examples of Sacred Soil, Asylum, and Collective Unconscious. All three heal you for standing in them and will also either reduce damage you take or increase healing you receive. Next, here's an example of Earthly Star. Standing in it doesn't do anything, but when the Astrologian clicks the button, it explodes, healing you and damaging enemies. Watch the dotted line to know where to stand. Finally, here's some examples of attacks your allies will use that you should move the enemies into. Machinist's Flamethrower, Ninja's Doton, and with a co-tank, Dark Knight's Salted Earth. Next, what can you use your Provoke, also commonly called Taunt, for? You can use it to establish aggro on an enemy. If you die, you can use it to quickly re-establish aggro on the boss. This is crucially important in a bad spot, that you do this as soon as your health is relatively safe. You can also use it to pull an enemy off a co-tank if they need help. In extension of that, Shirk is a tool used for tank switching. When you use it, you pass 25% of your enmity to your target. This way, when your co-tank taunts off you, using Shirk on them will really cement their lead. Some other ways you can help your co-tank includes 1. Some tanks have defensive tools that can be used on other targets. For instance, Gunbreakers can use their healing Aurora on their co-tank, or even someone else entirely. 2. All tanks can either share their short cooldown defensive option, or have a shareable version of it. If you're not actively tanking, you can make use of these to help your co-tank. Nearing the end, let's talk about what you do when things go wrong. When people start dropping, remember that your toolkit is primarily made to keep you alive. Sometimes you just have to use it in a slightly unorthodox way to survive. For instance, if your healer's dead, then prioritizing actions that heal you can be very beneficial. If your group isn't doing too well, you can use raid-wide defensive cooldowns to help them. Some particular examples include the fact that both the Gunbreaker and the Dark Knight have a 1-2-3 combo that heals them, but their maximum damage output options do not. So if your healers are dead, prioritizing these 1-2-3 combos over damage can sometimes keep you alive long enough for the group to recover. Paladins also have Clemency, known to be a massive DPS loss to use, yet it can save lives when you really need it. Preventing a death is a much bigger DPS gain for the group than the loss from using Clemency, even using it multiple times. There are also other tricks to use when at the end of your wits. Did you know that enemies have to turn to face you before they can attack? How about the fact they will not run up to you before they are ready to attack again? You can use both of these facts to minimize damage by running around. Just keep in mind that this will be very detrimental to your group's efficiency, but if it is a matter of survival, it's worth it. Whatever it takes to survive, just do it. Ask forgiveness afterwards. To round off, let's talk about when your group decides to pull for you. Sometimes, tank players can get so annoyed by this that they let the player pulling die. It is entirely to your detriment to do this. Let me explain why. If a DPS pulls for you and you let them die for it, then in all likelihood the enemies will either come for the healer next or you. Either way, you are now forced to deal with the same enemies, just now you're one player short. Additionally, while you may have prevented this DPS from doing this again, it is less likely they will cooperate as easily with you later in the dungeon. If instead, in the exact same scenario, you decided to intervene and save the DPS, now you're stuck with a group of enemies that maybe you don't think you can handle, but the best you can do is try. If you don't make it, you can ask a DPS to not do that again, and they will surely realize that it won't work out anyway. If, however, you succeed, you managed to do something you didn't think you could. As a result, you improved. So, instead of seeing your party pulling for you as them being rude, try to see it as them suggesting that you might be more powerful than you think you are. That is all for this video. I hope these broader subjects, tips and tricks are helpful. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or anything you wish to add, please leave a comment down below. Fun fact, back before Shadowbringers, tanks sometimes had so severe issues keeping aggro during pulls that healers often were taught to not heal at all until the tank had reached their destination.